in 2001, I stood in a barn in Missouri facing 50 small family farmers. But this wasn't my first visit. I was an attorney with the United States Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, and for 2 years, EPA and the farmers had been allies in a legal fight against mega hog corporations that were polluting the community's air and water. But on the day I stood in the barn, I'd flown out from Washington, D.C. for the sole purpose of telling everyone that EPA was walking away from the fight. Our government had chosen the corporate polluters over the farmers and their families who were suffering from the pollution. And unfortunately, these decisions have become the norm. Our political leaders have reshaped our policies, our regulations and laws to benefit just a handful of corporations who now control almost every aspect of our food system. But we can reverse this trend. As Food Inc. Director Robert Kenner has said, people must be transformed from passive eaters to informed shoppers to those who step into the political fray. Eaters must join farmers to save America's food system and to reclaim our democracy. What I learned from my case is that all over the country, small traditional family farms were increasingly being replaced by industrial complexes that crammed millions of animals into buildings where they had little to no room to move or access to light. The legal term for these facilities is Concentrated Animal Feeding Operation, or CAFO. They are often referred to as factory farms, but they're definitely more factory than farm. In a hog CAFO, the animals spend their whole lives standing on metal grates where the urine and feces drops to below the building, where it is then flushed out through a series of pipes and dumped into massive cesspools that can be 3 or 4 acres and 20 feet deep. The toxic brew is then sucked out and sprayed onto cropland, untreated, as fertilizer. But USDA studies show us that there's way more waste being produced in our country relative to the land available for application. So excess waste often runs off the land into our waterways. The farmers that I had met with filed a lawsuit in the late 90s in federal court against 2 of the biggest pork-producing companies in the country, Premium Standard Farms and Continental Grain. Together, these companies built 21 of these huge industrial complexes in just 5 counties. That included over 1,000 buildings where they warehoused 2.5 million hogs a year that produced the amount of waste of a city of 10 million people. That's as much waste as the city of New York and Philadelphia produce every year combined. They also built 163 of these huge storage pits. The millions of gallons of waste from these hogs wreaked havoc on the community. Waste that overflowed from these pits and excess waste that ran off of land caused massive fish kills. Toxic gases such as ammonia and hydrogen sulfide that come from the decomposing waste made people sick. And the flies from the rat-tailed maggots that blanket the cesspools ruined community members' way of life. The odors and the flies made it impossible for citizens to open their windows or to spend any time outside. EPA was supposed to fix this. At the farmers' request, we joined the lawsuit, and for the first time ever, we argued that not only were CAFOs violating our clean water laws, but also our laws intended to protect air quality. But in the middle of the litigation, right after the Bush administration came into office, I walked into work one day, and I was ordered to settle the case or lose it altogether. I was also ordered to stop every other investigation that I had started against a CAFO. I was stunned and I was furious. And in that moment, I was forever changed because I learned that justice and fairness aren't a given, even when dealing with an agency whose mandate it is to protect public health and the environment. Rather, it's something that we constantly have to fight for. I followed my orders, and we settled the case for much weaker terms than I believe we could have obtained had we been allowed to litigate. I also quit my job at EPA because I couldn't do my job, and now I sue them. Why? Why? Because 15 years later, the farmers are still suffering from the same facilities. and it's becoming increasingly difficult for citizens to obtain justice in all three branches of government. In the executive branch, which includes EPA, CAFOs remain essentially unregulated, even though they've been subject to our environmental laws for more than 40 years. Agriculture is the #1 source of water pollution in the country. Yet EPA claims that they do not even know where all of the CAFOs are. In July of 2012, due to political pressure, they dropped a regulation that would have required the industry to create a comprehensive inventory of all the CAFOs and to submit just basic information about how they're managing their waste. EPA has also turned a blind eye to enforcing our air laws against the CAFO industry. And worse yet, in 2008, they flat out exempted CAFOs from having to comply with some of our federal environmental laws that require the reporting of toxic chemical emissions, leaving communities in the dark about whether the air they breathe is as dangerous as it smells. The bottom line is that the farmers and I could not bring the same case today that we brought in 1999. So what about the legislative branch? Well, state legislatures every year try to pass laws that prevent citizens from fighting back against CAFOs or from even knowing what's happening at CAFO. For example, as of last year, 7 states had enacted ag-gag legislation, although citizens beat back 15 other similar proposals. These laws often criminalize the taking of photos and videos at a factory farm without its permission, and in some cases, even if you're standing in public space. They were enacted in response to undercover videos that revealed horrific animal abuse. And the industry knows that the public will not tolerate animal abuse, unsafe working conditions, or environmental problems that these videos reveal. But rather than correct their abuses, they're hard at work with their political allies, criminalizing the photos that bring these injustices to light. So what about our third branch of government, the courts? Well, courts can often be the last line of defense when lobbyists bankroll harmful legislation or politically capture our executive branch agencies. From ending segregation to promoting freedom of speech to recent court decisions defending same-sex marriage, court victories can create space for greater equity and justice. But when confronting entrenched power, even within the legal system, those on the front lines are at great risk. This is Terry Spence. He's the farmer whose barn I stood in 2001 when I confessed that EPA was caving to political pressure. He also is a leading plaintiff in the lawsuit. For his efforts to protect his community, he received an anonymous letter in his mailbox threatening to burn his family alive. He was also confronted by a relative who threatened to shoot him. The factory farm fight is pitting neighbor against neighbor, family against family, all across this country, not just in Missouri. This is Lynn Henning. She's a farmer who fights industrial dairies in Michigan. For her efforts to protect her community, she's been chased off the road. She's found dead animals in her mailbox, on her porch, on her car. And someone blew out her granddaughter's bedroom window when her granddaughter was just 20 months old. Not only are people literally putting their lives on the line for this fight, it is difficult for them to find help. Statistically, most lawyers practice in urban areas, and if you find a lawyer in a rural community, they often have conflicts because they represent the industry. Likewise, judges and potential jury members often have connection to the industry, making it difficult to get a fair trial. And finally, as important as litigation is, it's extremely expensive. So if you can't find a lawyer, you can't afford a lawyer, or you can't get an impartial judge or jury, courts can hardly be a level playing field. So the game is rigged. In all three branches of government, big agribusiness wields tremendous control and influence. But we can draw upon the lessons from every great social justice movement, including civil rights. Even a loss, if you pick the right fight, can catalyze great change. For example, in 1857, the United States Supreme Court, in the Dred Scott versus Sanford case, held that African Americans, whether free or enslaved, could not be US citizens and could not access the courts. Even though a loss, this decision aroused public outrage and was an indirect catalyst to the Civil War. And ultimately, we had the 14th Amendment to the US Constitution, which gave African Americans full citizenship. But what changed over time wasn't the legal system. It was the cultural context in which judges and other elected officials confronted issues of civil rights. What was morally acceptable in 1857 was no longer acceptable 10 years later. As with the civil rights movement, I believe we're on the side of right, but right isn't good enough. Civil rights leaders didn't sit by passively awaiting change because they're right. They had to fight, and they still have to fight today. Likewise, we in the food movement need to decide that we're going to fight the injustices that I've described and the others talked about on the stage, whether it's hunger, junk food marketing to kids, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. It doesn't matter. They all stem from an imbalance of power between corporate interest and people. Corporations have an appropriate role to play in our society. But as President Grover Cleveland recognized even in 1888, corporations, which should be the carefully restrained creatures of the law and servants of the people, are rapidly becoming the people's masters. To change this imbalance, we need to do the long-term and difficult work of building political power to make meaningful changes in people's lives. And we need to work together. Numbers matter to elected officials. As a former colleague, Brother Dave, used to say, eating is a moral act. If you eat, you have a stake in our food system. Not everyone can exercise their market power, even though it's critically important, but not everyone can buy organic or even have access to healthy food. But everyone can engage politically. And the good news is there's lots of organizations that help you do that, whether you have 5 minutes or more, online or off. And then there's many ways you can engage. You can push a button to send a letter to your representative, which seems like a small act, but when these organizations generate 80,000 emails in 1 week to a targeted official, that can make a difference. You can participate in a rally, talk to your officials directly, or vote for a candidate committed to change, because that's the only way we're going to get better judges, better legislators, and a better executive branch. I'll even hook you up with a hog or a chicken suit if you want. The point being that there's no excuse. There's ways for everyone to engage, and together we can make a real difference. We have made a lot of progress. We have had wins in the courts. We've had wins at state legislatures. And I think we've done a really good job of moving ourselves from passive eaters to informed shoppers. And there's still more to be done, but I think the next big step is collectively moving ourselves into the political space with our enthusiasm for good food and a demand for a healthier, more just, and sustainable food system. Terry Spence is still making change every day, not just in his own community, but he travels around the country now, helping others facing CAFO onslaughts so that they can learn from his fight so they will not be defeated. Only now he does it alongside his granddaughter, Ashlyn, who's decided to follow in her grandfather's footsteps despite everything that their family has been through. She's the next generation CAFO fighter. They still reject the hijacking of government and of their community specifically by factory farms. They reject the stranglehold that this industry has on the true American farmer and on the marketplace. Instead, they choose democracy and they choose action. We invite you to this fight to reclaim our food system and to make government work for the people. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure, I do want to cry, to introduce you to two of my personal heroes. Please help me thank them for their sacrifice and their inspiration, Terry and Ashlyn.